On behalf of the Union League Club, Board of Directors, and members, I would like to welcome everybody to our breakfast forum with Justice O'Connor. It is really an honor to greet Justice O'Connor today. Many of you may not know this, but Justice O'Connor is more than a guest. She is a friend. She is an honorary member of the Union League Club of Chicago. Many of us fondly remember Justice O'Connor joining us in 2006 when she was our guest speaker at the George Washington birthday celebration. It was a special time in many ways. We honor the memory of Justice O'Connor's husband, John, who was with us that day. On a lighter note, you may have recognized the Southwest theme of your breakfast entree. And that was also present, if you remember, back in 2006, Chef Garvin treated us all to chocolate tacos. And also recalling that wonderful occasion, the club offered Justice O'Connor a gift of a fly fishing rod. And I asked her this morning, I said, "Do you use that rod?" And she said to me, "I use all my fishing rods." At this point, I would ask all of us to rise as we offer the Pledge of Allegiance.
I'm fine. Where's the flag? Behind us.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The words we just recited, "to the republic for which it stands," give us context for our program today. Back at the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the public was waiting, monarchy or republic. The deliberations were in private. Benjamin Franklin announced to the crowd, "A republic, if you can keep it." Well, today we are gathered to examine the state of our republic and continue our pursuit of the sacred duties of citizenship. Our club's legacy is rooted in those sacred duties. In 1862, the Union Leagues of America were founded to support President Lincoln in his efforts to defend the Union. So that is the history of our club and our heritage. So we are honored today and very grateful to the Robert R. McCormick Foundation for bringing Justice O'Connor here today and for asking us to co-sponsor this important program. At this time, it is my honor to introduce the President and CEO of the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, Mr. David Hiller, who will introduce Justice O'Connor. Mr. Hiller?
Good. Good morning. Thank you all for being here and joining us for this wonderful breakfast conversation with Justice O'Connor. The Union League Club is a great partner and leader in all things civic in the city. And we are so proud on so many occasions, whether it's veterans or civics, to be able to join arm in arm with the membership of this club and all that you do for the city and state and country. So thank you all, and thank you for hosting us today. And I love the Southwestern breakfast entree that we had. Justice O'Connor had a couple bites of hers and sent for Tabasco sauce.
Kind of mild.
It was kind of mild. If you want to know where Justice O'Connor gets her zest, it may come in part from that. So, Justice O'Connor, welcome back to Chicago. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all of your lifetime and continuing service. In a little bit, we're going to get to the subject of your visit here, which was building support for returning civics and quality civic learning to our schools. But before we do, and with this wonderful audience here, some of whom are likely meeting you for the first time, I thought it would be interesting and fun to visit a little bit on some of your extraordinary life chapters, including, we mentioned the Southwest, but I wonder if you could start us off and tell us a little bit about the early years out west.
I grew up on a cattle ranch that was in Arizona and New Mexico. The state line split us along the Gila River. It was part of the Gadsden Purchase, you remember that?
Yeah.
And our country bought a chunk of land from Mexico called the Gadsden Purchase. And the reason we did is because our border with Mexico ended with the Gila River. And in the meantime, we had discovered engines that would propel railroad engines across the country. And we were able to then get cross-country rail traffic in our country. And it was a hope that there would be a rail line from New Orleans to Los Angeles. And they couldn't do it unless they bought some land below the Gila River. So that was why we made the Gadsden Purchase. And shortly after that purchase was made, my grandfather, Day, who was living and ranching and doing things in Wichita, Kansas, thought that he should buy a chunk of land in the Gadsden Purchase and do some ranching there as well. So that's why the Days ended up with land in the former Gadsden Purchase area. And he had to get some cattle to put on it. There weren't any cattle available in that region of the new U.S., and he went down to Mexico and bought a herd of cattle that had the Lazy B brand on it. Lazy means it's lying down, so it's a capital B lying on its side. That makes it Lazy B. And we became the Lazy B Ranch and remained such in the next 100 years. And that's how I grew up.
And you went to school in?
Well, I had to go to school, and there wasn't one anywhere. So my parents sent me off to El Paso, and I lived with my maternal grandparents and went to school there. And that was okay, except I was homesick for the ranch.
Yeah. And then how did you, you made your way to Stanford?
Yes, I graduated from high school in El Paso, and I was the only one in my class that applied for university admission outside of Texas. Everybody else was applying to Texas schools. And I sent an application into Stanford, and they took me. Surprise, surprise. I don't know why they did, but luckily they did. And that's where I went. And I really liked Stanford. Are there any people here this morning that by any chance went to Stanford? Any hand? Yeah, I see a hand or two. Good. Oh, yes, good. I really enjoyed Stanford. It was marvelous. So that worked out.
In El Paso in the early years, did you have any teachers who made a particular impact or influence on your?
Well, I'm sure I did. I remember a Mrs. Fuel who was kind of my early civics teacher in El Paso, and she was wonderful. I don't know how much I learned. There wasn't much to learn in those days except Texas history. And I got...
Well, there's a lot of that, though.
A lot of that. And I got pretty tired of hearing about Sam Houston and all those Texas heroes. Goodness sakes.
So, and you did your law school at Stanford also?
Yes, I took a class as an undergraduate student at Stanford from a law professor who taught an undergraduate class about the law, and that solidified my desire to apply to law school, which I did, and they took me for some strange reason. So I went, and it was marvelous. I really enjoyed Stanford Law School.
And you had a classmate that some of
I had a
us have heard
classmate
from
whose
also?
name was William Rehnquist. Remember that? Yes.
So, and then after law school, tell us about your search for a job as a law grad.
I met my husband-to-be, John, while in law school. He went to Stanford also, but he'd been deferred from the draft, and the minute he finished school, he was drafted. So we had some, time to adjust to there before we could settle someplace. And we decided in time, he took a job with a law firm in Phoenix when he finished his service requirement. And we went to Phoenix, and I needed a job because we both like to eat. And so I went looking for a job, actually, before we got to Arizona. I looked in California, and I had a very hard time finding an offer. It was amazing. I'd had a very good
You graduated
record.
near the top of your class at Stanford.
Yes, and was on the law review and all those things, published articles, but the employers really weren't looking for a woman, so it was a tough deal.
Am I correct in remember? Did you were offered a job as a legal
Well,
secretary?
Well, I was, but I didn't want to do that.
No.
So,
Good for
yeah,
you.
I was.
Yes.
But I applied, I wrote a letter to the county attorney in San Mateo County, California. Redwood City's the county seat, because he'd once had a woman lawyer on his staff. So I wrote him and asked for an interview. And he was willing to see me, but when I got there, he said he was very glad to meet me, but he wanted me to know that he was not in a position to hire anybody at that time. He didn't have any money left. He gets his money from the county supervisors, and he had used his allotted amount, and so he didn't have money left to hire anybody. And so I said that was all right. I'd work for nothing. That was fine. I said, I'll work for you for nothing until such time as you get a little more money from the county. And he said, well, I don't have an office to put anybody. He had walked me through, and all the officers were occupied. And I said, well, that's all right. There's room in where your secretary is to put a second desk if she wouldn't object. And that was my first job as a lawyer. No pay, and I put my desk in with the secretary. But I loved my job. It was really fun. I got to answer all kinds of questions about whether a certain county agent could do such and such that the agent wanted to do, and I really liked my job. And eventually, somehow, he got a little more money, and somehow I ended up with office space, so it all worked out.
Oh my! And you became a legislator
In Arizona.
in Arizona.
Yes.
Later. So how did
Yes.
that come about?
Well, John, my husband, took a job with a law firm in Phoenix, and I asked around for work in law firms in Phoenix. Not one of them would hire a woman. There were two firms that actually had a woman in their office, but it turned out that they were respectively a wife and a daughter of a lawyer in the firm. So they just really weren't hiring women. And I opened a law office in a suburb of Phoenix, in Maryvale, with a young man that I met while I was studying for the Arizona bar exam. And we just hung out a shingle and opened the office, and we didn't get the kind of problem usually addressed by the U.S. Supreme Court.
Indeed. But then, so how did you end up running for office?
Time went on, and I ended up, for a while, taking a position as an assistant U.S. attorney. Not U.S. attorney, Arizona attorney general's office. I took a job there for a while, and that was delightful. I liked that. And then over time, I was active as a precinct committee person in my precinct and staying abreast of who was doing what and running for this, that, and the other thing. And I finally had decided that maybe it would be good to run for the legislature in the state senate there. And I did, in time, run for a state senate seat in my legislative district, and I won the elections, so I served in the state senate for a time, and that was a good thing to do.
And became majority leader.
I did, which was the first time in the U.S. that a woman had ever held a leadership position in a legislative body. But it was interesting.
So one of the things that stands out is really interesting. So you served in in the
I
executive
served
branch?
in all three
Oh,
branches
all
of
three
Arizona state government.
branches.
Mhm.
And so how did that, as you then, you became in the Court of Appeals in Arizona, and then, of
Yeah.
course, on the Supreme Court, how did sort of
Well-
standing in the shoes of being an executive and also being a legislator then affect your view of judging?
Well, I hope it gave me a broader perspective of the three branches of government and what each one wants. And it was a good place to be. And in the meantime, there was a fellow named Ronald Reagan. Remember that name? And he was running for national office. And he thought he wasn't doing well with women prospective voters. And so he wanted to try to say something that might help him with women voters. And he started saying in his campaign that if he had an opportunity, if he became president, to fill a vacancy on the Supreme Court, he'd like to put a qualified woman on the court. And that was one of his campaign ideas. And of course, he was elected. And his former lawyer in California was a man named William French Smith from Los Angeles. He was in one of the big firms in Los Angeles. And Bill Smith became our U.S. Attorney General and under Reagan. And he told me that he started keeping a little handwritten list of names of women judges so that if the president did want his advice on what to do about filling a vacancy on the court, he would have something to look at. And he kept that little list under his telephone in the Department of Justice. And sure enough, before too many months, Justice Potter Stewart announced he was going to retire from the Supreme Court. And that opened a slot. And President Reagan then had to decide what to do. And I was in my office for the Arizona Court of Appeals when the phone rang one afternoon. I answered, "Hello? This is the White House calling for Judge O'Connor. Is she there?" "Yes, this is she." "I have a call for her." "All right, put him on." And it turned out it was our new president, Ronald Reagan. "Sandra?" "Yes, Mr. President." "I'd like to offer your name tomorrow for the Supreme Court. Is that all right with you?" And that was the conversation.
Had you known
Yes,
him?
no, I didn't know him. I mean, I'd met. He used to come occasionally to Arizona because Nancy Reagan's parents lived in the Biltmore Estates in Phoenix. And so he would come once in a while and make a speech at some event in Arizona. And I had said, "How do you do?" a time or two, but I didn't really know him. So that was kind of a shock. And so I said, "Yes, Mr. President." And the next day, he announced my nomination for the court, which was rather a shock for the nation.
So can you talk a little bit about the process of getting ready for the confirmation hearings and how the hearings were?
Yes, that's a frightening proposition because you have no idea what you're going to be asked by members of the Judiciary Committee. And you know that the questions are going to be widespread and broad, so a little speed reading came to my aid, and I got lots of briefing books on just every topic you can imagine in case that was what some of the senators wanted to ask me about at the confirmation hearing. You never know what they're going to ask about. So I did a lot of homework and tried to get briefed on various aspects of what was going on those days. And then we had the confirmation hearings, and I think it went reasonably well. At least at the end of the day, they confirmed me, so that was encouraging.
Unanimously.
It was, right? Yes, it was 99-0. And the one missing vote was Max Baucus of Montana. And he wasn't there that day, and he later wrote me a note, said he was sorry he couldn't be there, and he sent me a copy of the book, A River Runs Through It. So
he knew you were a fly fisher person.
I don't know, but anyway.
So, if memory serves correctly, there was a young special assistant working on the Attorney General's staff who helped prepare you for the confirmation hearings?
Yes, I got a lot of help by way of memos and briefing on every subject imaginable that I might be asked about.
And one of them was young John Roberts was in the office at the time?
He probably prepared one or more of those papers. Yes, he was working at the time in the Attorney General's office.
So you were confirmed 99 to 0. A lot of the confirmations since that time have not been 99 to 0. And can you reflect at all on how the confirmation process and the politics of it may have changed since?
Well, of course, we all know that it has. Some of the votes on nominees since then have been divided, as you know, and it's not a pleasant process to go through Senate confirmation. I don't know if any of you, probably some of you in this room, have maybe had to go through a confirmation process, but it's not a lot of fun, and you just have to do the best you can and do a huge amount of homework in hopes that what you're asked about, you'll be able to produce an answer that it's at least respectable. It's hard.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your visit here to Chicago and supporting the work of improving civic education. How did you, has become a passion of yours since retiring from the court, if you can call it retirement, you're staying so active. Tell us about your interest in civic education.
That started before I retired, as I've gone around the country, which I've done to some extent, to sit on cases in different areas and do some speaking, not a lot, but some. I became certainly keenly aware of the state of our education structure in the United States. And we stumble along pretty well, but really it has needed a lot of prodding so that we can do a better job. And one of the things that developed over time was my concept that we were not educating young people well enough about how our government works and how it's set up and what happens and what the citizen's role is and so forth. And so I succeeded in developing a program called Icivics. I mean, we have iPads and iPods and everything. So I thought we should have Icivics. And we got something together that worked pretty well and helped people in terms of teaching young people how the government works. And every young person is going to grow up to be your age, and they're going to have to vote. They're going to be our citizens and directing things. So it isn't too early to start teaching them. And that's how I got into it.
So talk a little bit about iCivic. So it's web, internet-based.
It's on the web. I'm not a big computer geek myself, but you have to be on there if you're going to communicate with the younger generation today. I mean, forget the old fogies like me. You've got to be on that web, and you have to be good at computer language and communication. And so that's what we've done. And we developed games that the young people play on this iCivics website. And for the games, I've had the most wonderful group of teacher advisors, just fabulous people. And they have helped say, well, we should be teaching them this, and here's an idea for how we might create a game about it. And then we've hired, there are game businesses, who produce marvelous games if you hire them to do it on a certain subject. And so we started doing that. And the result is just dynamite. I want each of you now, maybe you're as bad as I am about computers, but this is a homework assignment. You get on a computer, and if you don't know how to do it, get your grandchildren or children to do it. And look up Icivics, www.icivics.org. And on it, you will find 19 games now that teach some aspect of government. The most recent one had to do with elections, and so you'll find that. And the games are just really fun to play, and in the process, you learn how that little segment of government works, how it works. It's just great fun. And the young people really like them, and they really learn. And I've kept it free. I've been blessed by having contributions over the years from groups and people who believe in this system, and they've helped us pay for the cost of creating the games. And they're available to users at no cost. And I want you to look at it because it's really great. And I want you to tell the leader of any school where your children or grandchildren are going to be sure the school is taking advantage of these and using them because they're just marvelous.
And the word has spread, and Icivics is now used in all 50 states and cities around the country, including in Chicago. And Justice, I think we'll also take one moment out of we have a lot of, we talk about how civics is getting ignored in a lot of the schools. Happily, it's not in some schools. We have many teachers and students from Chicago area schools here today. Could you all stand and be recognized for what you do? Please, kids.
Good.
Over here.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you, and thank
Now,
teachers.
ask them to raise a hand if they've ever used Icivics.
All right, now, show of hands of the kids. How many of you guys have used Icivics?
Aha, see, there are a few up there.
Oh, a lot.
Now,
Yeah,
next
good.
time, I hope every hand goes up, because I want you all
Next
to
year,
look at
next
it,
time,
too.
I think it will be unanimous.
Yeah.
Yeah, so great, and thanks again. We have so many wonderful, committed teachers, and who are going to be part of this movement to do just what you're saying.
Yeah,
And
it's really, it
get-
works.
So, in terms of getting civics back again, one of the issues does seem to be that in this world of No Child Left Behind and all the standardized testing and attention to math and science, some
There's no
people would
time.
say there's no time.
I know.
So what do you say to people who say that?
I say make time. I mean, this is important. You know, it matters. And we have all the stuff prepared, and it's easy to use, so get with it. You can squeeze more in.
I think that's the best answer. Just do it.
Yeah.
Because this used to be, from the very beginning, the purpose of our schools historically was to educate the next generation of citizens.
Yeah, it's interesting. After we adopted our Constitution and got the government, federal government organized a little bit, it was about 30 years later that citizen leaders began circulating around and saying, look, we developed a pretty good new system of government here, but we need to teach every generation of young people how it works. We need to do that. So we need to get with it and start teaching. And that was why we got public schools in America. It was to teach the young people how this new form of government worked and how they would be part of it and making it work. So that need continues to this day because every generation arrives, they don't know any of this, they have to learn it. So it's never going to be inherited, they have to learn it. And that's why we have a continuing need for education in how our government works and how each of us are part of it.
So Illinois is one of only 10 states that doesn't have a requirement that civics be taught in high schools before one graduates. Obviously many other states do. Do you have a view on whether there should be a requirement for teaching?
Well, I don't care whether it's a requirement or not. I just care whether they learn it. See, I mean, teach it whether
said.
it's required or not.
And there are a lot, just the way you say it too, there are a lot of hollow requirements sitting on the law
Yes,
books
there
unless
sure
it's
are.
done, and there's good civic instruction like a lot of our colleague teachers and students do here, and there's teaching that's not so hot that, so there is a movement, and so many of the people in the room, we have guests from the MCFA Challenge were with us
Yes,
at dinner,
yes,
and
yes,
the groups
yes.
that City Year, Facing History in Ourselves, the Constitutional Rights Foundation.
That's
We
great.
had a lovely dinner earlier in the week, and Justice O'Connor was able to visit with a number of the civic leaders who were working on just this. And
Right.
I wanted to do a call out too to one of the great national leaders of this work. Ted McConnell is here. Ted, stand up. Ted runs the national campaign for the civic mission of schools. And so there are a lot of good things happening. We're as part of the Illinois civic mission of schools, which is sort of the Illinois version of what Ted has been leading. We've got a really strong group and a movement to create here what we call democracy schools, which are based on the best proven practices that for quality civic learning. So
Yes.
we're trying to do exactly what you're saying.
And
we'll-
Illinois will do it. Illinois has been a great state through the years, and you know how to get things done and do it well, so I'm sure this will generate good results.
On our good days, we do. Yeah, on our good days. So, Justice O'Connor, you have a new book out called Out of Order, Stories from the History of the Supreme Court that is just out. There are copies available out in the lobby, and it's wonderful. And I should say, my personal interest, I had the honor of being a law clerk on the court for Justice Stewart.
Potter Stewart.
Potter Stewart, who was and in fact, I was there in his second to last year, and then right after I left, he retired. Made me worry that I had tired him out or something from he was a great justice, and then...
He was a marvelous justice. You were so lucky. I don't know if any of you have ever focused on the role of a law clerk to a judge, but it is a really special relationship. And every member of the U.S. Supreme Court is able to have 4 law clerks, and that's quite a few, but there is such a massive amount of reading and things to go through. The court gets literally thousands of applications every year, petitions for certiorari, asking the court, this is my case, let me tell you about it, this is why you should take our case here in the Supreme Court. And the members have to read just thousands of these things, plus the opposing views from the other side. So there's just an enormous amount of work, and the law clerks are enormously helpful in this process. And and you form kind of a good relationship with the justice or judge who hires the law clerk, and that was a great thing for you to be able to do. And they only hire the best and the brightest, so he must have been all right.
Occasionally somebody else slips through, but I'll say that was plainly the peak of my career, right after.
No, but he was really a gifted justice. He was terrific, and he only hired the best prospects there. So
Well, you
were lucky.
you're nice to say. So how do you go about, because there are, and I remember that every week, and there are only more since I was there in 1980, but these giant book carts get wheeled in that have hundreds and hundreds of the petitions for certiorari, which are the requests to hear the case that you do have to go through.
And then you have the briefs on the other side,
And the
the
briefs
ones
on
that
the-
say don't take it.
Yeah, don't take. So how do you decide?
Well, you have to skim through them. And I say skim because the amount of reading is just massive, massive. And you have to be aware of what each person, each applicant is asking you to do to take a case to resolve some particular issue. Now, you do, with time, have a much better concept of the kind of case that the Supreme Court normally takes and should take. and it isn't, the majority of the petitions are in criminal cases, and that's a little easier to decide whether you need to take it or not. There are only a few issues out there at any given time in the criminal law field that the court would really need to get into, where there's some split of authority in the lower courts and you really need to resolve it. But just to give another voice to something that's been decided in the lower courts is not one you're going to take.
So when you're doing the work of the court, whether it's deciding which cases to take or how to decide them, are you working together with the other justices? Or mostly on your own? Or?
You're not reading with somebody else. You have to read all this stuff yourself and go through it at least and keep track of it. And you have little sheets where you check what you think ought to be done with the case. And so then your reading is finished. But boy, it's a big job.
Yeah. So how much time is actually spent together deliberating with the other?
Not that much, really. The justices get together at least twice every month when they're sitting around the table together and going over for purposes of making decisions on which cases to take or what to do with something. I think about twice a month they really have to sit down for several hours and do that.
And then
but not every day by any means.
And then several days of the week, early in the week, are spent, we'll hear oral arguments.
Yes, in the months in which the court hears oral arguments. And that is so interesting. If you're ever in Washington when oral arguments are heard, you'd find it interesting to sit in, even if that particular case is not of interest to you. You'd find it fascinating to see how the process unfolds. It's good.
And so, and I'm sure when we have lawyers in the audience, and so how often does oral argument change decisions?
Well, once in a while it does. My God, I remember sitting there one day in an oral argument and learning that the case had become moot. It no longer was relevant, so we kind of got rid of that one. So you do learn things in oral argument, and you learn a lot of other things too that affect whether you're going to vote to grant it or not.
One of the things, and you have a chapter on oral argument and historic oral arguers and things, and you also have a section where you talk a little bit about the lawyers who decide to try some humor in their argument. So is that a good idea?
I would be a little leery of it. I mean, a little bit is okay, but I would not think you'd want to just make that a planned endeavor in every case.
So like a lot of things in the practice of the court, it's changed a lot over the years. One of the things you talk about, and I hadn't realized, was in the early days, apparently they didn't restrict much in terms of the time.
They had no time limits. And in the early days of the court, the oral arguments in a given case could last several days, if you can imagine. That would get a little tiresome. And people would come and sit and listen to a lot of that. And for women, that was kind of the social thing to do. You'd get all gussied up and go down to the court and sit and listen to these things for a long time. It was kind of amazing that was the thing to do. That's what happened before television, see.
Yeah. Speaking of television, I know it's a question that comes up from time to time, and it can be controversial, but the issue of whether the Supreme Court would ever televise
it comes up every year, yes. Some lower courts have allowed television in courtrooms. When I was a state court judge in Arizona, the legislature had passed a law allowing cameras in Arizona courtrooms. So it was something that could be done there in Arizona. And I served long enough to see what happened. It was only the kind of spectacular case involving kind of gory details that anybody would ever ask for a camera in the courtroom. The ordinary case of some intellectual interest, never. But the case with grisly or gory details, yes. And that was the only interest in the television in Arizona when
Do you
it was
think
allowed.
I think our Supreme Court will ever televise?
I don't know, but I think not right now. I think I'm safe in saying I see no prospect in the immediate future.
But they do audio recordings, which
It
are
is,
released
you can
the same
get the
day.
audio recording that same evening, and there is the textual coverage of every word that's said. You can get that by the next day. So there's a lot of disclosure available if you really want to know what happened. But if you just want some kind of sensationalism, you're not going to see it on the television right now.
One of the flashing way back in the court's history, one of the interesting things you write about is that in the early days, it was very little was established in terms of what jurisdiction the court would have,
Right.
or what, and as a result, they hardly had any cases, and much of their time was spent on. They were required by law to ride circuit.
Every justice in the early days of the court was assigned a circuit. They still are today. In fact, I had the Sixth Circuit for a while, and each justice is assigned to be circuit justice for some circuit. And the only obligation today of that is that they hope that the circuit justice will come to their annual meeting where all the lawyers get together and maybe make a few comments. That's kind of it today.
But you, in your senior status currently, you will hear some cases in the courts of appeals
Yes,
still?
I do. I have volunteered to go to most all the circuits to sit in on a panel of 3 in that circuit to hear and decide a few cases. And I've been doing that now for some years. And it's kind of interesting because having sat for years to take cases from all the circuits and see how they work, it's kind of interesting to be on the inside now and sit with some of them and get acquainted with the judges and participate. It's been interesting.
So, in recent years, in the Gallup polls, the Supreme Court, which has historically always been right at the top in terms of organizations in which the public has confidence, has unfortunately fallen some in the public's
Yes.
eyes. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think in the more recent poll that was taken, the court slipped a lot. I think the Bush-Gore decision was not well received by the public, and I think that was a factor.
Yeah.
Maybe someday the opinion poll will go back up the other way. I bet it does.
You know, one thing that I've wondered about too is whether in some cases the so-called political branches of government are just as happy leaving controversial issues to the court and sort of letting the court deal with it because they either
they
don't
are.
want to. Do you think,
Absolutely.
think that
You're
happens?
right. Of course, you're right. Yeah. Push it off to some other branch.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I think we're in a little bit, so people can be thinking of having a question. We have mics in the room. There are a few ground rules we want to observe because the justice does still sit on active courts, and so we won't take questions about pending or future cases or cases that were decided while the justice was on the court, but other questions of general sort, we'd be welcome. So be thinking about that, but I'll ask one more before we get into that. You mentioned the President Reagan and his decision to appoint you. So, and as you refer to yourself sometimes as the FWOTSC.
Flotsic.
Flotsic. I didn't know how to pronounce it.
Yeah. Well, in Washington, D.C., you have to have acronyms and abbreviations for everything. And so I guess the abbreviation for first woman on the U.S. Supreme Court is Flotsic.
Yeah, it is. And so obviously that was was path-breaking. Can you, in the years since, now there are 3 women on the court?
Oh, it's amazing. When I go in the courtroom today and sit there as a member of the audience, which I like to do if I happen to be there, I look up and I see 3 women on that bench, and it is just astonishing. It's great. So that's been fun to see happen.
Yeah.
And it looks perfectly normal. You know,
Certainly.
it's okay.
Certainly does. Certainly. So let us throw it open. Who do we have? There are mics traveling. Who has a question for the justice?
We have a question back here in the back of the room.
Okay.
Thank you, Justice O'Connor, for your comments and for your tremendous service to our country. As you have had a chance to reflect, you're one of the few justices who actually left in, I think, the prime of your career. You've had a chance to reflect on the time that you were on the court and looking at the court as it's changed, similar to what David has commented on. What would be your hope for the next generation that would be on the court? You know, kids that are in law school now. What would you hope that they would accomplish?
I don't see any big changes. I think the court is doing its work quite well, and as I already told you, I happen to like looking at it and seeing at least 3 women up there. That's good. And I think the court has functioned remarkably well and has kept up with a heavy caseload and has done it right. I like what I see.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Hello, my name is Ethan Viets Van Leer. I wanted to thank you for speaking to us and thank the McCormick Foundation and everyone else for allowing students to come. I'm a senior in high school at Chicago Virtual Charter School, and I'm also a member of the Juvenile Justice Commission of Illinois, and we work a lot with racial disparities and issues of mass incarceration. And since Chicago is the ground zero for the war on drugs, and I was wondering what your view is on mass incarceration and the amount of people in color that sit in prison
Views
today.
on what?
Mass incarceration,
Large numbers of mass incarceration, the large prison population in Chicago, which is largely people of color.
Well, that's a reflection, of course, of the large population you have here in Chicago. I don't think proportionally, compared to other major cities in the country, that Chicago is sending more people to prison than other communities. It's just that you have a huge population here. So the result is rather large prison populations. And other nations do not tend to send people to jail as much as we do in the U.S. I think we are probably the nation that sends more people to jail than any other so-called Western nation
Yeah, by
would
a large
do.
factor, I think.
By a big factor. And I'm not sure that that is a wonderful thing to do. I don't think we've managed to correct too many. I look at the statistics on repeat offenders, and it's pretty high. So I don't think we're sending people to jail and seeing perfect results. We're not. And I hope that as a nation, we will continue to look at what we want to do. I think jail isn't a great answer, is what it boils down to. And so what can we do other than that would have better results? How can we do it? You certainly need to work one-on-one with the person who's the offender. You can't just have them stand in front of a judge and be told, you did wrong and that was bad and I'm going to do something about it. That doesn't seem to work too well. So it must require some continued supervision or connection in some way with the correctional officials so that over time there are a lot of contacts and a lot of efforts to teach the person how to go through life without committing crimes. And we're not doing a good job of it in this country. I think we all need to put our thinking caps on this problem. I see it as a huge problem.
There it is.
So,
Thank
We
you.
have our next question over on this side to your left, Mr. Hill.
Justice O'Connor, my name is Dan Larson, a high school teacher here in the Chicago area. Justice Holmes once said that law is not for poets, it's for thinkers, just like you said. But when my students read current court opinions, they seem to recognize more and more political poetry than principled thinking. Do you think politics has grown too prevalent in court opinions?
Are you talking about opinions of the U.S. Supreme Court or all opinions?
Opinions of the Supreme Court.
Oh, I don't think the court has made a noticeable change in what it's taking or deciding or why. I think it's about like you'd expect it to evolve over time, and it may not be what we like to see because we don't like to see mistakes made beneath by other levels of government, and yet we do see mistakes made, and that's why we have legal errors made that have to be corrected. So we can all do better. That's why I like my Icivics project, to make us think at a much earlier stage about what we're doing and how we're doing and why we're doing it, in hopes that over time we can do better. But I don't look at other nations and say, oh, there's a great example, we should emulate that. I don't think anybody has quite solved the problem. Do you? Do you have a suggestion?
Yeah.
The criticism is that the court has accepted the political criticism of its opinions, that they no longer reject that politics shouldn't be a part of judicial...
Well, now look, none of those cases are decided for political reasons. They just aren't. If you will read the opinions, they are based on legal principles, not political principles. And it could be that the outcome is favored by one political party more than the other, but that's okay, that's natural. But if you will read them, they're based on sound legal grounds, or they wouldn't be decided at all. And so I don't see that that's a big issue for the court, frankly.
All right, Justice O'Connor, another question over here.
Thank you for your appearance, Justice O'Connor. I'm Randy Swyko, a retired high school journalism teacher, and here's my question. Should American high school officials recognize their student news media as designated public forums rather than closed forums as a strategy for inspiring learning, experiential learning, and civic engagement?
So the question is should high school newspapers, high school journalism, be recognized as an open forum for First Amendment purposes? Is that
Yes, as a designated forum with greater First Amendment protection rather than a closed forum.
Look, it's still high school. These are youngsters running the paper and writing who are not yet adult. And the high school has an obligation to enforce certain standards for the high school. Now, I don't know what standards they're enforcing, but it certainly should not be treated the same as newspapers on the outside. I mean, these are still students who are under the jurisdiction of the high school. The high school's responsible for what they do and say. And so I think it's not going to be quite as free and open as it is for the adult press. And maybe that's not a perfect answer for the students, but that's reality. They're still
just
junior.
a follow-up real quickly. How do you protect against arbitrary censorship just to
of their
express
newspaper articles?
Yeah, just arbitrary censorship.
Well, I hope that the schools are sensitive to this. If there aren't, you ought to urge them to be sensitive to the fact that the students are going to be bitterly disappointed if the school is seen to be applying some terrible standard to their work for the newspaper, and that they should be very sensitive to it. And I think you're right to be concerned, because you want the students to learn in the process about the value of a free press and how it works in the adult world, and to feel like they're learning that themselves. So you don't want to just destroy their hopes and dreams of being treated like they would be in the adult world. So I think your focus has to be on working with the school leader, the school officials who are regulating them, to make sure that they do it in a very reasonable way, and to try to set standards for the school paper that will encourage the students to go into journalism, not discourage them for fear of unfair treatment. I think your concerns are valid.
That is such an important issue in not just in the area of journalism, but in all of
In all areas.
civics.
That's
Because
right.
what through a lot of the work that Ted McConnell and others have led, what too often happens in many schools is you teach the lessons of active, engaged citizenship in the classroom, and then it's denied in the hallways and in the clubs and
right.
and what the best and I'm sure it's the case of a lot of our schools who are here, is to have the entire school model really good citizenship.
Yes.
Which is that you get the kids engaged and they have voice and channels for expressing
But they're
themselves.
treated fairly.
Yes.
And as parents, I think you should not hesitate to speak out to school officials if you see that the school is not operating that way, but is being perceived by the students as being very arbitrary and unfair. I think you should, as a parent, pay attention.
Good, thank you. I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions.
Well, here we have one more over here. We can go there for the last question. This gentleman.
Hello, thank you for coming to speak with us, Justice O'Connor. I'm Matt Pyer from Lake Park High School. It's in the western suburbs of Chicago. My question is that now that we, obviously know that civic education in America has had, say, a downfall at least. My question is why that is overall.
Is why?
Why civics has had a downfall or a falling off in our schools?
I'm not sure, and I don't know if that's a national symptom or not. Maybe you've just had some bad experiences here, because it shouldn't be declining in terms of its significance, its importance, and the respect that we want to give to students who are engaged in these things. We use the schools as a place to learn for the adult world, and so you don't want to treat students in a way that's unfair or arbitrary in ways that would discourage them from being citizens as they become adults. So that's a legitimate concern, and I think it means you're going to have to talk to the school officials in a decent way, not yelling and screaming, but saying, look, we're here to learn, and we're afraid that the policies the school is following are policies that will not teach us the right way and not encourage us to participate. That's a tough deal.
Yeah.
Okay, your last question.
Hello, Judge. Thank you for being out here to Chicago. My name is Navy Lieutenant Jeff Gray, just recently returned from Afghanistan. Thank you. Judge, you are famously known for carrying around a copy of the Constitution.
Yes.
My question is, do you have that copy on you right now?
I do. Where's my purse? Is it over there on the back of my chair? Here it is. Here. Okay. Yep. I always carry it. I do. And what do you know? Here it is. They make smaller versions of it, and it wouldn't hurt in some of these schools that are learning and being part of the leadership for the school to get those little copies and present them to the student leaders that are doing these things.
And an iPad version.
Phone
version.
Yeah, you can get it on the iPad, but yeah. I prefer to carry it. I want to hold it.
And hold it tight. So
now, let me say one word, though, about this club. We got acquainted with the leader of this club back in his days in Arizona, believe it or not, back in the 80s.
John McCabe,
John,
right here.
where are
John.
you? John, stand up. And I go all, it's okay. I go all around the world and all around the country and stop in many places. And I don't have an experience that is the equal of this in other places in the country. So I think you're lucky here in Chicago to have this, and I'm sure you have other places too, that are equally open to having good discussions and good events and ways to get together in a meaningful way that matters to all of you. So congratulations, John, for keeping that going here, and to all of you for participating. Thanks.
Here, here. And on that note, please join me in thanking Justice O'Connor for being with us.
Yeah, I'm
and
glad
for all
I
of
could.
her service.
Okay, good.